at 3:17 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on a frigid afternoon in February, the Turkish government activated a clause buried deep within the 1936 Montreux Convention that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Black Sea. What happened next sent shockwaves through Moscow and forced the Kremlin to confront a reality it had spent decades trying to avoid. The Bosphorus Strait, that narrow 18-mile waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, had just become a choke point that could strangle Russian naval power in ways not seen since the height of the Cold War. The decision was not a closure, not a temporary restriction. What Turkey announced was something far more consequential. Ankara invoked Article 20 of the Montreux Convention, declaring the region to be under imminent threat of war, a designation that grants Turkey sweeping authority to regulate naval passage through the straits in ways that peacetime rules do not permit. The implications cascade across every dimension of Russian military strategy, Mediterranean power projection, and the security architecture of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. 21% of Russia's entire naval combat power operates from the Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol. That fleet depends on unrestricted access to the Mediterranean for everything from Syrian operations to submarine deployments in the Atlantic. Turkey just placed a hand on the valve controlling that access, and the pressure is building in ways the Kremlin cannot easily release. The timing reveals calculation. Turkey did not act during the initial phases of the Ukraine conflict, when such a move might have triggered immediate escalation. Ankara waited, watching Russian capabilities degrade through sustained Ukrainian strikes on Black Sea Fleet assets, observing Western sanctions erode Moscow's ability to replace sophisticated naval systems, and monitoring the Kremlin's bandwidth stretch thin across multiple theaters. The Turkish government activated this lever at the precise moment when Russia possesses the least capacity to respond effectively, when diplomatic isolation limits Moscow's coalition-building options, and when economic strain makes military escalation against a NATO member essentially unthinkable. The trap worked. Subscribe to Dr. Elena Harris right now, because what is unfolding in the Bosphorus represents a fundamental recalibration of Mediterranean power dynamics that will reshape everything from energy security to great power competition. And the next 72 hours will reveal whether Moscow possesses any viable response to this strategic encirclement. The Montreux Convention, signed in 1936, governs passage through the Turkish Straits with provisions that sound arcane until the moment they matter. The convention distinguishes between peacetime and wartime rules, between Black Sea powers and non-Black Sea powers, between commercial vessels and warships. Turkey, as the controlling authority, possesses the right to determine when circumstances warrant invoking wartime provisions, even in the absence of declared war. Article 20 states that when Turkey considers itself threatened by imminent danger of war, Ankara gains discretion to regulate warship passage as it sees fit. The language is deliberately broad. The convention does not define what constitutes imminent danger, does not specify what evidence Turkey must present, and does not require international validation of the threat assessment. Turkey decides. Turkey acts. Other nations adjust. Russia has operated under the assumption that its status as a Black Sea power provides guaranteed access regardless of geopolitical tensions. That assumption just shattered. The Montreux Convention does grant Black Sea powers more favorable terms than outside nations, but those terms exist within the framework Turkey administers, under conditions Turkey defines, subject to limitations Turkey can invoke. Russian destroyers and submarines require advance notification before passage. Tonnage limitations restrict how many and how large vessels can transit. Wartime provisions allow Turkey to deny passage entirely to belligerent powers while permitting passage to non-belligerents. The convention's architecture contains multiple pressure points, and Turkey just activated the master switch. The immediate impact manifests across three vectors simultaneously. First, the Russian Black Sea Fleet finds itself increasingly isolated within a maritime theater that has already proven deadly. Ukrainian Neptune anti-ship missiles, maritime drones, and airstrikes have degraded the fleet's combat effectiveness by an estimated 40% since February 2022. The flagship Moskva rests on the seabed. The Rapucha-class landing ship Novocherkassk was destroyed in Feodosia. Submarine berths in Sevastopol have absorbed direct strikes. Every additional loss cannot be replaced through the Bosphorus if Turkey maintains its current posture. Russian shipyards in the Baltic and Pacific can build replacements, but those vessels cannot reach the Black Sea without passing through Turkish-controlled waters. The fleet is trapped with its existing inventory, forced to manage attrition without reinforcement. Second, Russia's Mediterranean Squadron, known as the Fifth Operational Squadron, loses its primary source of rotation and resupply. This formation typically consists of 6 to 10 surface combatants, several submarines, and support vessels operating from the naval facility in Tartus, Syria. Crews rotate through the Bosphorus every 6 months. Munitions travel through the straits. Spare parts, fuel, and provisions move via this route because the alternatives, shipping around Africa or flying critical components, cost exponentially more and take significantly longer. The Mediterranean Squadron's ability to sustain extended operations depends on that Turkish choke point remaining open. Turkey just demonstrated it can close at will. Third, Russian submarine operations face catastrophic constraints. The Black Sea Fleet operates improved Kilo-class submarines capable of launching Caliber cruise missiles against targets throughout the Middle East and Mediterranean basin. These boats have struck Syrian opposition positions, launched attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure, and demonstrated Russia's ability to project precision firepower from underwater platforms that NATO struggles to track. The submarines require periodic maintenance that can only be performed at specific facilities. Some of that maintenance happens in Sevastopol, but major overhauls and upgrades occur at the Zvezdochka shipyard in Severodvinsk on Russia's northern coast. Moving submarines between the Black Sea and the Arctic requires passage through the Bosphorus. Turkey just made that rotation uncertain at best, impossible at worst. The economic dimension compounds the military crisis. Russia exports approximately 2 million barrels of oil per day through Black Sea terminals, with the majority flowing through the Bosphorus toward global markets. That represents 32% of Russia's total crude oil exports, worth approximately $104 billion annually at current prices. Turkish restrictions on warship passage do not directly affect commercial tankers, but the strategic uncertainty creates market pressure that manifests in insurance premiums, route planning, and buyer confidence. Energy traders price risk into every transaction. When a critical choke point becomes contested, even if commercial passage continues unimpeded, the risk premium increases by margins measured in dollars per barrel. Russia's already strained budget cannot absorb additional pressure on its primary revenue source. The grain corridor negotiations reveal Turkey's leverage in stark terms. Russia and Ukraine both export enormous quantities of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil through Black Sea ports. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, brokered by Turkey and the United Nations, established safe passage corridors that allowed Ukrainian agricultural exports to reach global markets despite the ongoing conflict. Russia withdrew from that agreement in July 2023, then rejoined after Turkish pressure demonstrated that Moscow's isolation was deepening faster than Ukraine's. Turkey possesses the geographic position, the diplomatic relationships, and the economic interests that make Ankara an indispensable mediator. Russia can attempt to bypass Turkish involvement, but every alternative costs more, takes longer, and delivers less leverage than working through Turkish channels. The Bosphorus decision amplifies that reality. China's response will determine whether Russia finds any relief from this strategic squeeze. Beijing imports approximately 1.6 million barrels of Russian oil daily, making China the largest single customer for Russian crude. Chinese refiners benefit from discounted prices that reflect Russia's limited market access and transportation constraints. If Turkish restrictions tighten and Russian export capacity through the Black Sea contracts, China gains even greater negotiating leverage to demand deeper discounts. Beijing has no incentive to rescue Moscow from a self-inflicted crisis. Chinese strategic calculations prioritize energy security, economic advantage, and avoiding entanglement in conflicts that do not directly threaten Chinese interests. Russia's Black Sea problems fall outside that threshold. China will watch, calculate, and extract maximum benefit from Russia's constrained position. The Syrian connection exposes Russia's most acute vulnerability. Moscow maintains 2 critical facilities in Syria, the Hmeimim Air Base and the Tartus Naval Facility, that serve as the forward operating positions for Russian power projection across the Middle East, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Everything that sustains those bases flows through the Bosphorus. Fighter aircraft can fly in, but munitions, fuel, spare parts, vehicles, and personnel move by sea. The Mediterranean Squadron, based in Tartus, protects Russian interests and signals Moscow's presence in a region where great power competition intensifies daily. If Turkey sustains restrictions that prevent reliable Black Sea Fleet rotation, Russia faces a choice between accepting diminished capability in Syria or finding alternative supply routes that cost multiples of current expenditures. The Suez Canal option sounds plausible until examined closely. Russian vessels based in the Northern Fleet could theoretically transit around Europe, through the Mediterranean and into the Black Sea via Turkish straits during peacetime, or support Syrian operations directly from the Northern Fleet without entering the Black Sea at all. The journey from Severomorsk to Tartus covers approximately 5,800 nautical miles and requires roughly 16 days at sustained cruising speed. Fuel costs alone exceed $2, $4 million per vessel for a one-way transit. A Baltic Fleet vessel faces similar distances and costs. Sustaining continuous presence in Syria using Northern or Baltic Fleet assets requires dedicating significantly more vessels to rotation cycles, multiplying fuel expenditures, and accepting that any vessel in transit cannot perform missions in its home theater. Russia's naval inventory cannot support that level of sustained deployment without creating dangerous gaps elsewhere. The land bridge through Iran presents theoretical alternatives with practical impossibilities. Russia could attempt to move supplies overland through the Caucasus, across Iran, and into Syria via Iraq. The infrastructure does not exist to support military-scale logistics through that route. Road networks are inadequate. Rail connections are incomplete. Border crossing agreements would require negotiation with multiple governments that have their own interests and vulnerabilities to Western pressure. Iran faces its own sanctions regime and cannot risk additional economic punishment by serving as a transit corridor for Russian military supplies destined for Syria. The land route remains a fantasy that planners might sketch on maps but cannot implement at the scale and speed required. Air transport costs make sustained operations prohibitively expensive. Russia could fly supplies into Syria using heavy transport aircraft, like the Il-76 and An-124. One Il-76 carries approximately 50 tons of cargo over a range of 2,700 miles. The flight from southern Russia to Hmeimim Air Base covers roughly 1,200 miles, well within range. Fuel costs for a single round trip exceed $85,000. A single ship passing through the Bosphorus can carry 8,000 to 12,000 tons of cargo at a fraction of the per-ton cost of air transport. Replacing maritime logistics with air transport would increase supply costs by factors of 20 to 30 while reducing total throughput. Russia's defense budget, already strained by Ukraine operations, cannot absorb that multiplication of costs. The diplomatic fallout spreads across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Turkey's decision forces Russia to acknowledge that Ankara operates as an independent actor, pursuing Turkish interests rather than as a reliable Russian partner, constrained by economic ties and energy dependence. Russia supplies approximately 45% of Turkey's natural gas imports, creating an assumed leverage point that Moscow has deployed in past negotiations. That leverage just proved insufficient to prevent Turkey from activating the Montreux Convention's wartime provisions. Energy dependency flows in both directions. Russia needs Turkish payment for that gas to offset sanctions-related revenue losses elsewhere. Turkey can threaten to accelerate its diversification into liquefied natural gas imports from Qatar, the United States, and Azerbaijan. The mutual dependency creates a negotiating environment where neither side possesses decisive advantage. NATO's reaction reveals the alliance's strategic coherence in ways that Russian planning assumed would fragment under pressure. Turkey is a NATO member. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty obligates collective defense of member states against armed attack. Russia cannot respond to Turkey's Bosphorus decision with military force without triggering NATO's collective defense mechanisms. That constraint is absolute. Russian military doctrine includes scenarios for conflict with NATO, but those scenarios assume initial aggression from the alliance side or conflict beginning in the Baltic states, where Russian forces possess geographic advantages. Attacking Turkey to force open the Bosphorus would unite NATO in ways that abstract threats from the Baltics do not, would provide legal justification for coalition intervention, and would position Russia as the clear aggressor violating international norms. The Kremlin cannot accept those costs. The Black Sea becomes a strategic dead end under this new reality. Russian military planners designed the Black Sea Fleet to serve as a multi-role force capable of power projection, sea denial, amphibious operations, and submarine-launched strike missions. That design assumes the fleet can operate both within the Black Sea and beyond it, rotating through the Bosphorus to conduct Mediterranean operations while maintaining Black Sea presence. If Turkey sustains restrictions that make rotation uncertain or impossible, the fleet's design becomes misaligned with its available operating environment. Sea denial within the Black Sea requires fewer assets than global power projection. Submarine operations matter less when the boats cannot reliably reach the broader Mediterranean and Atlantic. The fleet becomes optimized for missions it no longer performs, while under-equipped for the constrained environment it now occupies. Ukrainian strikes amplify every problem Turkey's decision creates. The Black Sea Fleet has absorbed losses of at least 11 major surface combatants and auxiliaries since February 2022. Ukrainian Neptune missiles destroyed the cruiser Moskva. Landing ships have burned at dock. Dry docks have collapsed under air attack. Every loss would be manageable if Russia could rotate replacement vessels through the Bosphorus from shipyards in the Baltic or Pacific. Turkey's restrictions make that replacement impossible, transforming temporary losses into permanent capability reduction. The fleet is shrinking through attrition that cannot be reversed through available means. Each additional Ukrainian strike pushes the fleet closer to a minimum viable force threshold, below which it cannot perform essential missions. The nuclear dimension looms unspoken in the background. Russia maintains tactical nuclear weapons at multiple Black Sea facilities. The weapons serve as deterrents against conventional NATO intervention and as a last resort response to existential threats. Turkey's decision does not directly threaten those weapons, but it demonstrates that non-nuclear pressure can constrain Russian options in ways that Moscow's nuclear arsenal does not deter. Turkey did not fear Russian nuclear threats when making the Bosphorus decision because those weapons exist to prevent regime-threatening invasions, not to compel third parties to grant naval passage rights. Nuclear weapons prevent certain categories of threats while remaining irrelevant to others. Turkey's move falls into the latter category, exposing the limits of nuclear deterrence in gray zone conflicts where adversaries operate within legal frameworks and avoid direct military confrontation. The historical precedent cuts both ways. Turkey closed the straits to warring parties during World War II, maintained neutrality while controlling access to the Black Sea, and emerged from the war with its sovereignty intact and its strategic position enhanced. The Soviet Union fumed, but could not compel Turkey to alter its posture without risking war, at a moment when Nazi Germany posed an existential threat that consumed all available military capacity. The current situation contains eerie parallels. Russia fights a grinding war in Ukraine that absorbs military resources, faces economic pressure from Western sanctions, and cannot afford a second major conflict with a NATO member. Turkey acts from a position of geographic advantage, legal authority under international convention, and alliance backing that makes Russian military response prohibitively costly. History suggests Turkey can sustain this position indefinitely if Ankara possesses the political will. The energy transit question adds layers of complexity that few analysts anticipated. Beyond naval vessels and cargo ships, the Bosphorus serves as a route for oil tankers carrying Russian crude to global markets. Approximately 1.4 million barrels per day of Russian oil transit through the straits, bound for refineries in the Mediterranean, Asia, and beyond. Turkey's Montreux Convention Authority covers warships, but not commercial vessels, creating a legal distinction that should protect oil flows. However, the convention grants Turkey broad authority during wartime conditions to regulate traffic for safety and security reasons. If Ankara decides that increased tanker traffic poses environmental risks or navigational hazards, both legitimate concerns given the strait's narrowness and the volume of traffic, restrictions could extend beyond military vessels into commercial shipping. Russia cannot easily challenge such restrictions without appearing to prioritize oil revenue over environmental safety. The insurance market reacts to uncertainty in predictable ways. Maritime insurance premiums reflect assessed risk based on geopolitical stability, route safety, and historical incident rates. The Bosphorus already commands premium rates due to its narrow passage, high traffic volume, and complex navigation requirements. Turkey's invocation of wartime provisions under the Montreux Convention signals increased risk regardless of whether actual restrictions on commercial shipping materialize. Underwriters respond to signals, not just to actualized events. Insurance premiums for tankers transiting the Bosphorus have increased by an estimated 18 to 23% in the 72 hours since Turkey's announcement. Those costs embed themselves in the final price of Russian oil, eroding Moscow's already compressed profit margins and making Russian crude less competitive against alternative suppliers. The domestic political calculation inside Russia reveals a Kremlin backed into a corner of its own construction. President Vladimir Putin has staked his legitimacy on restoring Russian great power status, demonstrating that Moscow cannot be pressured or contained by Western alliances, and proving that Russia's geographic position and resource wealth provide leverage that smaller nations cannot match. Turkey's Bosphorus decision undermines all three pillars simultaneously. A NATO member just constrained Russian naval power, using legal mechanisms Russia cannot challenge without appearing to violate international law. Russia's geographic position, usually portrayed as a strategic asset, providing depth and resource access, becomes a liability when critical waterways pass through foreign-controlled territory. Russia's economic leverage through energy exports proves insufficient to prevent Turkey from acting against Russian interests when Ankara calculates that the strategic benefits outweigh the economic risks. The information warfare dimension cannot be ignored. Russian state media will frame Turkey's decision as Western manipulation, as NATO pressure forcing Ankara to betray a partner, as evidence that Turkey subordinates its sovereignty to American demands. The narrative serves domestic consumption, reinforcing the siege mentality that Russian propaganda cultivates to justify ongoing military expenditures and economic hardship. International audiences will see through the framing, recognizing that Turkey acts in Turkish interests after calculating that Russia's position has weakened sufficiently to make this move relatively safe. The gap between domestic narrative and international perception creates cognitive dissonance that erodes Russian soft power even as it sustains domestic political support. The Syrian calculation becomes the immediate test of Russian adaptability. Moscow maintains approximately 5,000 military personnel in Syria, operating from Hmeimim Air Base and the Tartus Naval Facility. Those forces depend on logistics flowing through the Bosphorus for everything beyond what can be flown in on military transports. If Turkey sustains restrictions that prevent reliable resupply, Russia faces a choice. Option 1. Accept reduced capability in Syria, pull back from forward positions, consolidate around the coastal facilities, and acknowledge that Russian power projection into the Middle East just contracted significantly. Option 2. Attempt to establish alternative supply routes through Iran or via increased airlift, accepting exponentially higher costs that the defense budget can barely sustain. Option 3. Negotiate with Turkey from a position of weakness, offering concessions in other areas to restore Bosphorus access, while revealing that Moscow's strategic position is more fragile than Russian rhetoric admits. None of those options deliver outcomes the Kremlin desires, but one must be chosen within weeks as stockpiles at Syrian facilities deplete through normal operations. The choice Russia makes will signal to observers worldwide whether Moscow retains the capacity for strategic adaptation or whether the Ukraine conflict has consumed so much decision-making bandwidth and economic resources that Russia can only react defensively to challenges from previously manageable partners. China's silence speaks volumes. Beijing has issued no statements supporting Russia's position, has not condemned Turkey's invocation of the Montreux Convention, and has given no indication that Chinese diplomatic pressure will be deployed on Russia's behalf. That silence reflects calculation. China benefits from discounted Russian energy, enjoys leverage over a weakened Moscow that increasingly depends on Chinese markets, and has no interest in antagonizing Turkey, a nation that controls critical Belt and Road Initiative routes and maintains important economic relationships with Chinese firms. Russia's Black Sea problems create opportunities for China to extract additional concessions in energy deals, technology transfers, and diplomatic alignment. Beijing will not rescue Moscow from a crisis that serves Chinese interests. The European Union's response reveals the strategic coherence that Russia assumed would fracture. Turkey's decision aligns with European interests in constraining Russian military power, yet Brussels has issued no statements pressuring Ankara to reverse course. The absence of pressure indicates acceptance or possibly quiet approval. Europe's energy security concerns might suggest support for maintaining open maritime routes for Russian oil exports, but the EU's strategic calculus has shifted toward reducing energy dependence on Russia, even at the cost of short-term economic pain. Turkey's move accelerates that decoupling by making Russian Black Sea energy exports less reliable and more expensive. Europe accepts the cost because the strategic benefit, Russian military constraint, outweighs the economic disruption. The timing aligns with Ukraine's spring offensive preparations in ways that cannot be coincidental. Ukrainian forces have degraded Russian positions in the south, struck logistics hubs across occupied territories, and demonstrated increasing capability to threaten Crimea, the peninsula that houses the Black Sea Fleet's primary facilities. Turkey's Bosphorus decision arrives as Ukraine prepares major operations designed to retake territory and further degrade Russian combat power. The synchronization suggests coordination, or at minimum shared strategic assessment, that this moment offers maximum pressure when Russia possesses minimum capacity to respond across multiple fronts simultaneously. Coincidence is possible. Coordination is more likely. Either way, Russia faces compounding pressures that strain available resources past the breaking point. The naval balance in the Mediterranean shifts in ways that will take years to reverse. NATO naval forces operating in the Mediterranean, led by the U.S. Sixth Fleet with contributions from France, Italy, Spain, and Greece, already possessed overwhelming superiority over Russia's Mediterranean squadron. That superiority increases each day that Turkey's restrictions prevent Russian reinforcement or rotation. The Black Sea Fleet cannot surge forces into the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean squadron cannot be reinforced from the Black Sea. Russian naval power in the region degrades through mechanical failure, personnel rotation limitations, and deferred maintenance as supply chains constrict. NATO's advantage, already decisive, becomes absolute. The implications cascade through Middle Eastern security calculations, deterrence equations, and alliance confidence assessments.